Hey everyone, Cursed Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted, and here we are with Mr. House, President and CEO. This is a Mardu dice rolling, treasure making casino deck filled with attractions that you get to visit to give you that New Vegas experience. This is one of our donation decks for the week, coming from Lexa, who says, "There's a commander that is built around dice rolling and artifacts. I guess it shouts attractions. I've gone with a treasure package for the non-attraction section of the deck, but I'm not as sure about that half of the deck as the attraction half," which I think they mean they're not sure about the attractions in the deck and the half of the deck that's attractions. Absolutely. Looking at this deck, I really do feel, let's just say, a divide between the two halves of the deck. We'll definitely go into them to kind of talk about it, and I do have, I think, a few solutions for it, but there is a sharp edge down the middle of this deck, and I think we're gonna have to solve it. So let's get right into it so we can find out what attractions are, what Mr. House does, and how they work together. If you'd like to take a look at the deck list we're talking about today, or if you'd like to submit your own deck list to me so that I can make a video assisting your deck, please check the video description down below. So who is Mr. House, President and CEO, and why are they our casino commander? I really don't think there's any other commander that fits this casino vibe just as well, but still a very, very good choice nonetheless. Mr. House is a red, white, black, 3 mana total, that's Mardu colors, for a legendary artifact creature human. 0/4. Whenever you, they have 2 abilities. Whenever you roll a 4 or higher, create a 3/3 colorless robot artifact creature token, and if you roll a 6 or higher, instead create that token and a treasure token. Do note that this doesn't say what kind of dice you have to, or die you have to roll. This just says 4 or higher or 6 or higher. So if you roll a d20, which is a much higher chance of getting a 4 or 6 or higher, well, you're gonna have an easier time. Then they have a second ability that says, for 4 and tap this, roll a 6-sided die plus an additional die for each mana from treasures spent to activate this ability. So if you generate treasures and then spend those treasures back into this ability, you get to roll a bunch of dice again and hopefully hit 4s and higher or 6s to get more treasures, more robots, and kind of go off that way. I will say I really do like his first ability way more than his second ability, because the second ability feels obviously like a gamble, whereas the first ability is just good no matter what your deck is doing. So what are attractions? Well, attractions come from Unfinity, one of the unsets, the newest one, that had a bit of a controversial decision to make some of their cards black border, and so you could play them anytime you want. So you could put stickers on your Magic cards whenever you wanted to. Definitely not a decision I loved. I really enjoyed Unstable a lot more, but the attraction part of Unfinity is really, really cool. Basically, you create an attraction side deck of a minimum of 10 cards, and when you play cards that say open attraction, you randomly pick, technically you draw off the top, your attractions, put them onto the battlefield as artifacts. Information Booth is one of them. This is probably the best one if you ask me. And the way they work is this: at the start of your turn, I believe it's upkeep, I actually don't have the information, maybe we'll look up later, you roll 1d6, and then if the d6, the number that's landed, correlates to a glowing number on the attraction, you visit that attraction. Now, 1 is always off and 6 is always on, so ideally you always roll 6. Ideally you always roll 6s, but 6s are the best because they'll trigger all your attractions, but every now and then, as long as you don't roll a 1 with sufficient attractions, you should definitely just trigger one of them. So for this one, a 2 or a 6, which means 1/3 of the time, on average, you should be drawing a card, which is a pretty cool deal when you think about it. And when you start thinking about this as a collection of several different attractions, all with different numbers, oh, it won't let me, interesting. It won't let me go through them, but we can look at them here, each with a different effect and each with a different kind of benefit, and some of them going off at the same time. We can see how we're going to get a lot of advantage on our turns. Now, talking about the deck itself, we are at 36 lands and a curve that looks pretty nice. We are very hard on the 3 mana curve with a 3 mana commander. I don't usually love that. I've been thinking I need to have infographics for the things I tend to repeat, so I can just flash them onto the screen so you don't have to hear the whole spiel again. But generally, you don't want the highest mana cost in a deck to be the same as your commander, because it creates a tension in the deck of whether or not that first cast of the commander is stopping other cards from being able to be cast. And 3 mana tends to be the hardest one, outside of like, you know, the hardest one that's reasonable, right? Because there's a lot of 3 mana cards that are good, and if you get to, in order to cast 2 of these 3 mana cards, because you have so many that are really, really good, you need to hit 6 mana, which is quite a bit further than, you know, having the most at 2 mana where you just need to hit 4 mana to cast 2 of them. Now, of course, you could cast a 3 mana, 1 mana on 4, but, you know, generally you're going to see a lot of these 3 mana cards, and it is a bit of a problem. That being said, we kind of don't have a choice on a lot of these. We're playing the full bobbleheads from Fallout, the ones that get better with more bobbleheads on the battlefield, and therefore that is at least 6, I believe. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I've been playing New Vegas 7 Special, yeah, 7, right? I've been playing New Vegas recently, and I do really like the game, but I don't know everything about it. So these 7 3-mana cards that are kind of mandatory in the deck, and I'm going to tell you, don't take them out, they're great, are going to increase the curve dramatically. Where at 24 permanents, we would be at 17 without them, but I'm not suggesting to take them out. Now, talking about the deck itself, we have very clearly a bit of a divide in the deck, because this is a deck that is playing cards such as Ride Guide. Ride Guide enters the battlefield, opens an attraction, otherwise is a 4/4 human employee. That's it. This is not a very strong card, but is one of those necessary evils in order to play attractions. In the same deck, we are playing Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer, we are playing Dockside Extortionist, we are playing Smothering Tithe, and we are playing also somewhat relevantly Stormkiln Artist. I don't know how to point out that there is a bit of a power level problem in the deck of what the deck wants to be. Now, I'm not gonna bury the lead. I'm gonna lay out what my suggestion for this is, and for some people it's disappointing, and for some people it's thank goodness, and I'm going to tell you to take out those cards. Ragavan, you know, take out Dockside, take out Smothering Tithe. This is another infograph I'd like to have. There's this idea where we have a flavor we're trying to bring into the deck, and that flavor is something we're interested in doing well. However, the flavor itself, in this case attractions, isn't very good. Or I should say, isn't very strong. Good is a made-up term. It's not very strong. It's fun, it can be accessible, but the power level is low. And so to even it out, we're playing cards to balance it to a higher power level and make the deck functional. I don't think this is wrong. I think this is how we build decks. Unless you're like me and you're playing to a strict budget sometimes, generally you want the deck to feel good to play, and we have to take certain concessions. You know, a lot of people talk about how they get tired of playing staples in Commander, but generally there's certain staples we have to play just because we want the deck to function. You can see here we have the fetch lands, once again way more powerful than the attraction package. However, we need that for a 3-color deck is the idea. I'm going to say a card like Ragavan might be putting our finger on the scale just a little too much. Just a little too much, pushing it in the direction of trying to power up the deck past what it should naturally be. I think you got to kind of take a bit of an L here and understand that the attraction dice rolling deck is not going to be the strongest deck you have. And I don't think there's any shame in it. I think it's absolutely fine to limit, the power level of a deck like this. And I'm not saying you should completely take out all of the stronger parts of the deck. I think we should just remember that one half of the deck is a 2-mana 1/1 that opens an attraction, and then the other half is Dockside Extortionist. So definitely cut the highest and strongest cards. There's some that are still very strong, but I think is fine. Lotho, I feel like, is very much so fine in a deck like this. And otherwise, like even Zorn and cards like this are generally good. Prosper is way too strong. I would definitely cut Prosper. Gold Span is close. I would just, you know, just a notch downwards. Just take it a notch downwards. You're going to have a lot more fun. You're going to be able to use, because, not to go further on the point, but if you want to play a game where you're getting the bobbleheads out and you're trying to get the Exodia bobblehead collection, you want to get Luck bobblehead and roll, 7 dice and get 7 sixes and immediately win the game, well, you're not going to survive if you're playing Dockside Extortionist. And no matter how much you tell me, Curse, I'm just casting baubles with those treasures. No, I'm gonna knock you out of the game. It's a matter of principle. It's just the right thing to do. I don't care if you're being cute. You can't just resolve Dockside and expect us not to pick on you, right? And so with that in mind, I think taking down the power level, and then we're going to try to get some additions that work with the dice rolling side while still kind of shoring up some weaknesses of the deck. I will say, in terms of a few other cuts I would make, we can see how many cards here open attractions, and I'm going to suggest that maybe the highest mana ones are probably not the ones we want. Specifically, Ride Guide and Soul Swindler, I think are probably just a little too janky. I'm gonna later advocate for Ephemerate, but as a placeholder for Blink strategies, and I think Blink in white will make your smaller, this one doesn't have an ETB, but Deadbeat Attendant, even at 4 mana Complaints Clerk, blinking these will be better than spending 5 mana on Draconian Gate Bot or Ride Guide or Soul Swindler. So I think those should come out too, and we should just reduce that the weakest parts, but also reduce the strongest parts. We're cutting the top and bottom a little bit. I don't know how well that translates. I gotta see in my camera and I look ridiculous. So with that in mind, are there anything else that I'm really bothered by? Hit the Mother Load feels ambitious in a deck like this. To say that this card, you're spending 7 mana to create, let's say, a bunch of tapped treasure tokens and maybe get a free cast out, feels, I don't know, that's a lot of mana to use on something that doesn't win you the game or progress your board state. But once again, if the power level's low, this is fine. This is fine. Let's look at some additions. One that I didn't put here is the Girapur Aether Grid. I just thought of it while looking through your deck. And I think this would be a pretty good use of the attractions. This inspired things like that. Is it inspired? But I think it is. These things are really, really good at, using the attractions. Because we forget that they're on the battlefield. They're not in nebulous command space. And they are artifacts on the battlefield. So being able to tap 2 of them at a time just to deal 1 damage here and there. And this works really well with treasures, obviously. I think this is just a really good inclusion that works on theme with treasures and with the, even with the robots, honestly, right? Because if the robots are summoning sick, or if there's no good attacks, you could turn the robots sideways to deal 1 damage here and there. And if this can do I'm going to say 4 to 5 damage, what is that, 10 artifacts? I think that's reasonable. Especially if you remember that this is any target, so you can use it to snipe down creatures. I think this will be a really strong addition to the deck. But let's talk about dice rolling. Oh, these are the attractions. I didn't want to go through all of them. I looked to see if there were any that were particularly missing. I didn't think so. I think something that's really notable is though there are a lot of attractions, there's 50 of them, only 22 of them are legal in Commander. The rest of them have this little acorn, let's see, over here. And a lot of them are prize, you get prizes for doing something, but you can see we have a dexterity one, which they don't want to be legal. Let's see another one. That one seems really simple, but I don't know why. Regardless, a lot of these just do not work in Commander, which severely limits our collection. And if, whoops, I'm going the wrong direction. If for people who don't know why we don't just run the 22, it's just common in Magic that you run the fewest number of cards you possibly can, so you can regularly get the better ones as opposed to having to dig through the worst ones. And that might not come up for Commander players as much, because Commander decks have to be 99 cards plus the Commander, so 100 cards. But so you can't change the number, but this attraction deck should be 10 cards. Okay, I'm just going to close this one so I don't go back to it. So Barbarian class is the first dice rolling card that I think definitely belongs in this. Very, very simply, it is a class enchantment, which means you level it up. And that first level at 1 mana to just give you an additional dice to roll every time you roll dice is just so good. It basically makes your, I believe it's lucky, or what is it in D&D? It's like with advantage, right? Is that D&D? Where you get an additional roll and you get the best version of the, like, you get the best one to keep. Now, this isn't exactly that, because you don't double your roll. So if you have 6 rolls, you get 7, which isn't the same. I know this is weird. This is the thing to think about value and probability, but this works really well with things when you roll dice 1 at a time, because it doubles the number of dice you roll. And if you're rolling like 6 dice, which some things do here, it's not as good. Still, very, very strong at 1 mana. At 2 mana, I do like that this says, this gives a little bit of power, but the menace here I really, really like. Giving it to a robot, making it a 5/3, giving it menace and attacking is really nice, because then if they do want to block it for some reason, they're trading 2 cards, hopefully, for your token, which I think is a really, really good deal. And then the level 3 creatures you control have haste is really nice. I don't know how often this deck really relies on that. Oh god, you could play Ancient Copper Dragon. You could play the card I really don't like that rolls dice and plays with treasures, because this would give it haste and I wouldn't hate it as much. But generally, I think this is not as important. I think the first 2, and at 3 total mana for the first 2, I think it's a pretty good deal. Next one is Will, Blade of Frontiers. Once again, a very good dice rolling card that I think is particularly missing here. Same thing whereas the previous one, where whenever you roll 1 or more dice, you get 1 additional and you ignore the lowest. Really nice, but also whenever you roll a dice, put a +1/+1 counter on Will. Now, I think honestly Will is a little weaker generally, because destroying a creature is easier than destroying an enchantment, and Will is technically double mana for that first ability. However, I think at the lower power level this deck will find itself at, this is going to be a pretty big creature that can attack a lot of the time. Once you get past, I would say, about 4 toughness, Will can attack pretty well, and then you'll be able to make profitable attacks. You won't worry about lightning bolts, and like this will be a good card. Still, just for that first ability, I think is strong enough for this deck. Then I wanted to suggest 2 cards that have the roll d20 text on them that are still pretty decent cards. Contraband Livestock is a pretty good card in Commander. It is very much so somewhat a 2 mana, I guess it's Resculpt, right? Is it Resculpt that exiles a creature and makes a 4/4 in blue? This is pretty much that, but you have the chance of making a better creature for you, not for your opponent. So at less than 10, they get a 4/4. At 10 to 19, they get a 2/2, and otherwise they get a 0/1 at 20. I'm not really playing this for the worry of what they're getting, and I don't really care what they get in the end. A 4/4 is easily double blocked by your robots, so if they get really angry at you and start sending the Ox at you all the time, you're kind of fine with it. It's more the d20 and the exile. Being able to take out someone's commander and rolling a d20 to almost guarantee the robot and almost guarantee the treasure you'd get from Mr. House is really, really strong. Likewise, Will's Reversal is a redirect, which is sometimes a redirect and copy, is pretty good. I really do like that you get to add the greatest power among creatures you control to kind of push that further, and at a certain point that makes this 15 almost impossible not to get. If you think about it in the sense that 5 robots is enough to guarantee that this will trigger, and more realistically 3 or 4 should be enough to guarantee if you have a decent roll, that's really, really good. That being said, remember that the number we're looking at for Mr. House will be that d20. You don't get to add the number of the power and then check for Mr. House's ability. I'm sure that's obvious, but I think it is worth considering. And for those who sometimes are unsure how to use these spells, remember that this is a counter spell. 4 specifically counter spells. This is more the thing I think about, especially in Mardu colors, and a few other spells work this way, where the thing you're worried about is stopping your opponents from interacting with you, and you can just use when they cast a counter spell, target their own counter spell with their counter spell using this spell. Then the spell will obviously fizzle and you will get to keep your spell. Otherwise, there's going to be a ton of times this is value removal. And I will say, sometimes you might just use this to guarantee a second casting of the spell. So for example, at late game, maybe when 1 or 2 opponents are knocked out, you might use like Swords to Plowshares and then cast this on your own Swords to Plowshares just to get that second cast to exile a second card if you're really low on resources and you're like, close to being dead and you really need something. It's not the best use of it, but it's a pretty nice floor. One more dice rolling card that really, really caught my eye is Maddening Hex. Now, I'm not a big fan of the cost of this card in terms of money, but it's a really, really cool card. I think it costs so much because it's like dice rolling and cursing. Everyone likes this. But the idea is that you attach this to it, you curse a player, and then whenever they cast a non-creature spell, they roll a d6, they take that much damage, and then, they don't roll the d6, you roll the d6, they then take that much damage, and then you randomly attach Maddening Hex to one of your opponents, one of your other opponents, so it can't curse the same player twice. Now, here's the thing about this card. You have very, very little control over it. The only thing we can kind of do is use that Barbarian class or Will to increase our odds of rolling well, but otherwise, this is just kind of play it and forget it. But the reason I really like this is that on certain turns, this can be very useful, or turn cycles, I should say, this can be very useful to triggering Mr. House, like a few times, maybe once or twice before the turn cycle comes back. The dream is that, at least the first time you can ensure this, you enchant your opponent that's directly after you, right? And they will cast a spell eventually, and when they do, it has to be one of the next 2 players. And since they will eventually cast a spell, especially during the setup phase of the game, you're highly encouraging them to let you at least roll 2 d6s. And those d6s are free, and it's free damage, and I really like that. Now, sometimes the chances of this, or like how the dice roll, are just not going to be in your favor, but I would consider if this spell can do, 9-ish damage and trigger your commander twice or 3 times, it's very much so worth its cost. So I do like it. I don't know if I would necessarily recommend it as my top recommends, but it's definitely a really cool card. So I said this before, but I do want to consider Ephemerate and Blink abilities. Ephemerate being the best for sure, but there's a few other here and there that you might consider, but at least Ephemerate. Namely, I want to use this on our attraction creating creatures in order to get a second trigger. Because of how attractions work, we do kind of have a hard limit of the amount of attractions we can open. We have all 10, and as they get destroyed, they go to the scrapyard, and I believe that they're gone forever because you can't pull artifacts out of the scrapyard. And with that in mind, I want to hit like 5 or 6 per game, and Ephemerate can guarantee at least 1 more, and maybe a second one if you use it right. And so I really like that, but even beyond that, this protects your commander from targeted removal. It protects certain creatures from targeted removal. If you're a monster and you keep Dockside, Ephemerate and Dockside is a mess of a card to put together. I think the utility of this card, the fact that we have treasures, which makes it very accessible to cast a lot of the time, is going to really pull its weight. Once again, after this, you can play a few more, but I think starting and finishing here will probably be enough. Speaking of instants, I thought one that you could play is Dispatch. This is the second time I'm recommending Dispatch in a week, and I think once again you are playing enough artifacts, especially with treasure tokens, that the metal craft on this is very, very accessible to you. Being able to exile something for 1 mana, as we know, Path to Exile, Source of Plowshares, this is just another card you can use to a lot of gain, and I think it's pretty free for you to play. An artifact that I think is a little bit missing here is Idol of Oblivion. Just its ability to draw a card off of a token, which, let's remember, it's not just the treasure tokens, the robot tokens, which are 4 or more on a die, is very, very accessible here. So being able to draw a card over and over again, I think is going to be very, very nice. And for 2 mana for that effect is cool. I have never seen this second ability be used, ever. But I'm sure at one point it'll be very strong. So I would definitely play this, especially because it keeps getting reprinted. I remember for a while it was like, it must have been $2-3, but now it's dirt cheap and I would absolutely pick that up for this. Another one that's recently printed is Comball, Profiteering Mare. This is a card that I have to keep rereading because I keep being told I'm not understanding what this does. And it's good, but I feel like I don't love it. But here I think it does a really, really good job, right? This basically doubles your tokens enter the battlefield once a turn, and the tokens come in tapped. But something that's interesting is if that first token generation is more than 1 token at the same time, you will get that many. Usually it does only give you the first copy and it stops working. It says 1 or more create 1 copy. This one creates a copy for each of them, but only once per turn. Now, I think it's going to be a little harder to trigger this on your opponent's turns, but you can kind of roll with Mr. House in order to do that. And it's going to generate quite a bit of tokens. But mainly that second ability that starts draining from your opponents. It's technically not drain, but whatever. You'll gain 1 life, they'll all lose 1 every time. Will add up if you can trigger this repeatedly. And thank goodness this doesn't have the once per turn clause, so you can get a lot out of it. Very, very cool card, great character, really happy to see them again. Now, my last 2 additions may be a little cute. The first one is probably cuter than the second one, but the second one's expensive. So how do we roll for more attractions? There's not really a lot we can do. It's just one of those things that there's not a lot of ways to double or to trigger it more often. It makes attractions kind of have a ceiling and power level, but the guaranteed way to get more attraction rolls is to take extra turns. Now, that's kind of hard in our colors. Red has a bunch of take extra turn spells, but you usually lose the game directly after. So with that in mind, I was looking at artifacts. Magistrate's Scepter is kind of a slow card. It is an interesting card, but it is a slow card. Every 3 turns, basically, you get to get another turn, but the cost is 12 mana over several turns. Now, there's a lot of ways to make up for this. I would say things like, for example, proliferation, manually adding charge counters, tapping and untapping a bunch of artifacts. But overall, I don't think that's gonna be good enough. And that's why I wanted to suggest this one, Gonti's Aetherheart, but it is, well, like quite a bit more expensive. Gonti's Aetherheart or another artifact ATBs, you get 2 energy counters. And I hate this so much, I have to manually count. At 8 exiling this card, you take an extra turn. So this is 6 mana to eventually take an extra turn. It's still not a very, very good card, but we don't have access to this ability in any other reasonable way, and so there's a few other ways, but they're not as good. But so here, we're gonna come back to that, but for 6 mana and playing a few other artifacts, which is really, really easy to do in this deck, you get to take this extra turn pretty quickly. In fact, I would suggest that, like, if you can generate artifacts even on other players' turns. You can still use this on their turn and just, wedge your turn in between your opponent's turns. It's probably not as good as having 2 subsequent turns, but it is an extra turn. It's actually an extra roll for all of your artifacts and your attractions, and like a bunch of different effects. Garaport Aether Grid, for example, gets a lot better this way. The card I'm thinking of all of a sudden is Aeon Engine. This is a weird one. I didn't think of this, but I kind of like it. So this is a very, very budget, very kind of low power, but accessible take another turn spell. Now you might say, but Curse, that doesn't say take another turn, it says reverse the game's turn order. So for example, what you do with this is you end your turn, and after your next opponent starts their turn, you use this. From this point on, the turn will come back to you. So you're not directly taking 2 turns in a row, but you're pretty close to doing that. And you're in a way pseudo-skipping 2 players' turns, which I think is really, really cool. Then you mess up the turn order. I think it's a really, really interesting thing with a lot of perks in a deck like this. Is it the best? Is it like the strongest thing you can do? No, but I think it's a particularly fun thing you get to do. If you have some untapping abilities, once again, if that interests you, this gets even better. And I think the untapping would be Unwinding Clock, which would be the last card I add in this addition sections, which just lets you untap all artifacts, works really well with Garaport, works well with just a bunch of things, getting extra effects, rolling with your commander because they're an artifact again, and then, of course, some of your bobbleheads get to be triggered again. This should have probably been the first card I suggested. This is probably the best card to add in terms of theme, but here we are as the second last card. What's the last card, you might say? Well, it's Deer or Old Lightning Bolt. I don't care what power level we're at. I don't care what's going on. We're in red. Let's play the Lightning Bolt. Never hurts. Strong card. Love it. Need it. Good. And that's where I'm going to end this. Mr. House is such a cool commander, and I really like this deck as an idea and where we're going with it. I'm just a little concerned with the sheer imbalance in power level. Dockside Extortionist is a hell of a drug. Be very careful with it. Don't take it at home without supervision. So with that in mind, I just really think, if we take out the really strong cards, I think we have a really fun deck that when you and your other players get together and you say, I've got a lower power attraction deck, it'll be what they imagine. Because when you say that and you play Ragavan, no one's going to believe you again. Thank you so much, Lexa, for setting the deck. I hope this was helpful to you. I'm really excited to hear about how this goes. Mr. House looks like so much fun. Good luck and happy deck building. Thank you so much for watching. This video is brought to you by viewers like you and people on my Patreon. If you'd like to send me another draft of this deck, or any deck, there is a link in the video description down below. And if you'd like to make your deck one of my donation decks I work on, there's a link there too. Finally, if you'd like to like, comment, subscribe, I would be very appreciative. It helps the channel quite a bit. Thank you and good luck in brewing and building.